Great, welcome to the second lecture of the second week of Philosophy 1500.02, Introduction to Logic Online. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about validity, right, and some heuristics for determining validity. Okay, so let's start off with a quick review of the central concept that we've been talking about so far and we'll continue to talk about for the rest of the course. That's validity. So by this point, you should have the definition memorized, and judging by the quiz that was due last night, or Sunday night rather, it seems like some of you don't have it memorized, or at least you don't quite understand it. So let's walk through it really quickly. So an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. Right, so what this tells us is that an argument's valid just in case, right, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Right, so if it were possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, the argument would not be valid, right, and an argument's invalid if and only if it's not valid, so the argument would be invalid. Right. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we're trying to figure out whether or not an argument's valid or invalid, whether its premises are actually true and its conclusion actually true or actually false, right, that doesn't matter, right? We're asking what's possible, right? So sort of intuitively what we want to do is imagine a situation where the premises are true and then ask what would have to be the case, right? Would the conclusion have to be true or could the conclusion be false? Right? If the conclusion has to be true, if the premises are true, then the argument's valid, right? But if it's possible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true, right, then it would be invalid, right? And it's that central, or it's that sort of idea that we're going to be using as we develop a heuristic for testing arguments for validity in this lecture. Great, so the heuristic we're going to use is laid out on this slide. So first we're going to want to identify the premises and conclusion of the argument, and then we'll ask, can the premises be true and the conclusion false at the same time? That is, what we're going to try to do is imagine a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Right? So if you can correctly do that, right, then the argument's invalid. Right, so why does this work? Well, remember that an argument's valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time, and an argument's invalid if and only if it's not valid. So if you can imagine correctly a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false at the same time, right, then you can show that the argument's invalid, right, because that situation would show that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. Of course, if you're unable to do this, right, that is, if you're unable to identify, imagine a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false at the same time, right, this doesn't show that the argument is valid, right, it might just be that you're bad at imagining things. Right, so we're going to start with this example. I like this example because it's easy to imagine what's going on. So I'm just going to give you the premises and the conclusion to start with. So first premise, if it's raining, then the street's wet. Second premise, the street's wet. Conclusion, it's raining. Right, so what we're supposed to do, right, now that we've identified the premises and conclusion, well, they've been given to us, we're supposed to imagine that the premises are true and then ask if the conclusion has to be true. Right, so in this case, right, let's suppose that if it's raining, then the street's wet and that the street is wet. Intuitively, would it follow that it's raining? Right, so think about it for a second. So I say it doesn't follow. So suppose that it is raining, or sorry, excuse me, let's start over. So suppose that if it's raining, right, then the street is wet, and suppose that the street's wet. It turns out there are lots of ways for streets to be wet besides it's raining. Right, so perhaps the sprinklers are on or there's a water main break. Right, so in that case, it would be the case that the street's wet and that if it's raining, then the street is wet, but it wouldn't follow that it's raining. Right, so this argument is what? So think about the definitions again. So an argument's valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time, and an argument's invalid if and only if it's not valid. Well, I hope I've convinced you that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, so the argument's invalid. Right, so this next slide illustrates what we're going to be doing in the rest of the lecture. First, I have a little bit of prose, like a paragraph, and then we're going to try to figure out what the premises and the conclusion are, and then we're going to try to figure out whether or not the argument's valid or invalid. So to begin with, we'll start with the
Right, so here's how I've reconstructed the argument. Premise 1, Moby Dick was written by Shakespeare. Premise 2, Moby Dick is a science fiction novel. Conclusion, Shakespeare wrote a science fiction novel. So what we want to do is figure out if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true as well, or could it be false? Right, so what we want to do is imagine a situation where the premises are true and see what follows from them, right? Is it the case that the conclusion has to be true or not? So in some examples, it helps to tell a story, right, to see how the premises could be true. To that end, here's a quick story. Shakespeare lived longer than he in fact did, right? That's possible. And he got interested in the whaling industry, also possible. And he wrote this book called Moby Dick, also possible, right? And it turns out that Moby Dick is about this time-traveling Captain Ahab fellow, right, who travels throughout space and time chasing a great white whale named Moby Dick. Okay, suppose all that's true, right? It's not actually true, but that doesn't matter. Suppose it is true, right? Would it follow that Shakespeare wrote a science fiction novel? Well, if Shakespeare wrote this novel called Moby Dick and it's a science fiction novel, then it would follow that Shakespeare wrote a science fiction novel, right? It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, so the argument's valid. Right, here's our next example. So this time, again, we have our little argument, and we'll have to put it into premise-conclusion form, and then figure out whether or not it's valid or not. Right, so here's our little argument. Chicago is a city in Michigan, and Michigan is part of the United States. Therefore, Chicago is a city in the United States. So maybe pause this and try to figure out what the premises and conclusion are. Now would be a time to pause. Right, so here's what I think the premises are. Chicago is a city in Michigan. Michigan is a part of the United States. In conclusion, Chicago is a city in the United States. So I did this by looking for a conclusion indicator word, right, therefore, right, and then sort of going back and looking at the rest of the passage, and it turns out that that stuff is supposed to support what I've identified as the conclusion. So those are the premises. Okay, so this one, we could either tell ourselves a story, or we could use sort of part-whole reasoning, but let's start off with a story. So suppose that Chicago is a city in Michigan. Well, as a matter of fact, we know that's not true. It's a city in Illinois. And suppose that Michigan's a part of the United States. Well, that's actually true. So what we want to do is tell a story where Chicago's a city in Michigan. So I take it there are a lot of ways that could happen, but here's one way it could happen. A long time ago, this is actual history, Michigan and Ohio had a war over a little strip of land around Toledo. Suppose that Michigan went to war with Illinois as well, right? And it won, and it took over what is now Chicago, right? So this would be a case where Chicago is a city in Michigan, right? We don't have to imagine much other than what's actually the case for Michigan as a part of the United States. So suppose both of those are true. Right, would it follow that Chicago is a city in the United States? Right, so think about it for a minute, maybe pause me, try to figure out if this is valid. Right, so I say it's valid, right, so if Chicago is a city in Michigan, right, and Michigan's a part of the United States, right, it just follows that Chicago is a city in the United States. We can also think about it as like part whole, right, so suppose that Chicago's a city or a part of Michigan, right, and that Michigan's a part of the United States. I say it follows that Chicago is a part of the United States. All right, so here's another example. Since Winston Churchill was English and Winston Churchill was a famous statesman, we may conclude that at least one Englishman was a famous statesman. First premise, Winston Churchill was English. Second premise, Winston Churchill was a famous statesman. Conclusion, therefore, at least one Englishman was a famous statesman. There's a typo there. How did I do this? Well, since is a premise indicator word, right? And we may conclude that is a conclusion indicator phrase. Right, so that suggests that what comes after since is premise up until we may conclude that, which is conclusion. Right, so our question is, could the premises have been true and the conclusion false at the same time? Right, so let's suppose that Winston Churchill was English and that he was a famous statesman. Well, this is a special case where, as a matter of fact, right, the premises are true. But again, that doesn't matter for determining validity or invalidity, right? We want to ask, suppose the premises are true, would it follow that the conclusion is true as well? So what do people think? Maybe pause me, think about it for a moment. Right, so it turns out, of course, that if Winston Churchill was English and was also a famous statesman, then there's at least one Englishman who is a famous statesman, namely Winston Churchill. Right, so if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Great, so the argument is valid. All right, so this is a fun example, I think. The United States Congress has more members than there are days in the year. Therefore, at least 2 members of Congress have the same birthday. Right, so this would be very tedious to draw. So let's sort of think about what's going on. So first, what's the premises and what's the conclusion? Well, therefore, right, we know is a conclusion indicator word. So that suggests that at least 2 members of Congress have the same birthday as the conclusion. And the rest of it is just premise. Right, so that gives us this. Premise 1, the United States Congress has more members than there are days in the year. And conclusion, at least 2 members of Congress have the same birthday. Right, so good. So let's suppose that the first premise is true. Would the conclusion follow? Well, so what are we imagining with that first premise? Right, so let's suppose that we have all the members of Congress in alphabetical order, right? And let's suppose that the first one in alphabetical order was born on January 1st, and the second one in alphabetical order was born on January 2nd, and the third one in alphabetical order was born on January 3rd. And you see where this is going, right? So keep doing this for all of them. Right. Now, we're supposing that there are more members of Congress than there are days in the year. So eventually we'll get to the 366th one, or 367, depending on, if it's a leap year or whatever, in alphabetical order. And there will be this question, well, what day were they born on? Right. So given that every previous member of Congress was assigned a birthday in some day of the year, right, this one we know will have to have a birthday. Right, but anyone that it's on, right, it would have to be the case that some other member of Congress already has that birthday, right? So it would follow that at least 2 members of Congress have the same birthday, right? So suppose the premise is true. Could the conclusion have been false? No, and for the reasoning just given. So the argument is valid. Right, so this one I think is fun as well, although I might have a low bar. So here's the argument. Since some fruits are green and some fruits are apples, it follows that some fruits are green apples. So first we should ask what's the premises and conclusion, and then could the premises have been true and the conclusion false at the same time? Right, so here's what I've reconstructed as the premises and the conclusion, right? And you can reconstruct for yourself why this is the case. First premise, some fruits are green. Second premise, some fruits are apples. Conclusion, some fruits are green apples. Okay. First, what are the premises? Second, what's the conclusion? Well, we've already given them. Now we ask, could the premises have been true and the conclusion false? Okay. So here's something important. When we're imagining whether the truth of the premises and seeing if the conclusion is true or false, right, what we're actively trying to do is figure out a situation in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false at the same time. So here's one way you could have done this, and it would give you the wrong answer. Imagine that some fruits are green and that some fruits are apples, and you imagine among the green fruits are some apples, right? Then it would follow that some fruits are green apples. But note that it doesn't have to be that way. So suppose that there are only 2 types of fruits, limes and red apples, right? So then it would be the case that some fruits are green, namely the limes. Some fruits are apples, namely the red apples, but there'd be no fruits that are green apples. right? So what we've done is we've imagined a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false at the same time. So even though there's a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is true, right, that doesn't matter, right? What matters is that there's some situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, right? The one just described. So the argument is invalid, right? Because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. All right, and here's our last example. If Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England. Barack Obama is not a native of New England. Therefore, Obama was not born in Massachusetts. Okay, so what are the premises? What's the conclusion? And could the premises have been true and the conclusion false at the same time? Maybe pause me and try to put the argument in premise conclusion form. Right, so here's how I reconstructed it. So if Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England. Obama is not a native of New England. Therefore, Obama was not born in Massachusetts. Why did I choose that conclusion as the conclusion? Well, there was the conclusion indicator word. And again, this isn't always foolproof, but here it didn't lead us astray. Okay, so could the premises have been true and the conclusion false? So let's imagine that if Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England. That is, suppose part of what we're supposing here is that Massachusetts is a part of New England, right? So that if Obama was born there, then he'd be a native of New England. And then also suppose that he's not a native of New England. Would it follow that Obama was not born in Massachusetts? Well, so we know that if Obama was born in Massachusetts, then he's a native of New England, right? But we know that he wasn't born in New England, right? Because we know that he was not a native of New England, right? So it would follow that he was not born in Massachusetts, right? Because to have been born in Massachusetts, right, would be to be a native of New England, which we're told is not the case, right? So is it possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false? It's not, right? So what does that make the argument? It makes it valid.